There are times when history is a chain, when history is oppressive, when even though the present is constructed by the past, that past prevents us from constructing a future. And what we tell you today on the side of opening government is that when history is oppressive, when history does prevent individuals and people from self-actualizing, the state has both the duty and the legitimacy to alter that history to liberate its citizens. What I'm going to talk to you today about is exactly how history can oppress people. But I'm also going to talk to you about the nature of history, why it's an interpretive act, and why the state is permitted to reinterpret that history for the benefit of its people. What we say is that too often, people inherit the role of oppressor and victim. They're born into these roles. They don't choose them, they don't want them, but that's the reality that they walk into. They have beliefs about themselves in relation to society. They believe that because historically society has oppressed them, it must do so today by definition. They believe that because people who looked like they do, or believed the things that they believed, were cut out from participation, that they, too, are unable to participate. They believe that because people in the past were cut out from participation, that they have a duty not to participate, to honor those in the past. And it is this narrative that can lock people in a structure from which they can't escape, in a structure of exclusion from both sides. And what we propose today is a way to liberate people from the chains of history. We give you the example of African Americans in America. Many African Americans don't want to integrate into white society because they hate white society. They don't hate white people, but they hate white society because they know that this is a society that had their forefathers in chains, that exploited them. And they believe that that exploitation must continue into the future based on that pattern. Too many people are caught in this narrative. What we say is people would be unambiguously better off if they didn't have that narrative. I will take it, go ahead.
Wouldn't it make more sense to have a narrative that says that we systematically oppressed the black Africans in the past, and traces of that remain today, and that's why we have to change this?
Right. The difference is that people look at the past as a template for the present and a template for the future. When Muslims remember the Crusades, they don't think, oh, you know, Europe 1,000 years ago was really, really different than Europe today. I guess I shouldn't blame Europeans for anything. No, they think it happened before, it can happen again, it might be happening right now, and that's how you get Islamic fundamentalism, that's how you get Arab nationalism. People don't think that the past is a completely different country. They don't forget the past. They don't, throw it away. It lives with them. It creates their identities in the present. And we think that people should be able to have the freedom to recreate their identities without that burden on them. But furthermore, we say that the nature of history is inherently interpretive. That's the meaning of narrative. Without narrative, history is just a bunch of atoms moving around. There's no inherent meaning to it. There's no inherent truth. It only takes on meaning when we interpret those actions in a certain way. And there are many different ways to interpret history. Many American historians would argue that the nuclear bombings of Japan were an absolute necessity to end a brutal war. Many European historians would say this was equivalent to genocide and it killed hundreds of thousands of people and that America should be ashamed of this. It's very difficult to say which of these narratives is the true narrative. It's very difficult to say that there's an absolute truth out there in history that we must absolutely protect, and any narrative that doesn't conform to that one is by definition untrue. So what we support today is the government can do whatever it wants to rewrite that history. If the government has to manufacture evidence, go ahead and do it. If the NSA has to crack down on every Wikipedia article, go ahead and do it. We say that random collection of atoms should not limit people's choices today. The bouncing around of those things should not define people's identities in the moment. Now, what we might hear from the opposition is that knowing these histories prevents them from happening again. They might tell us, it's only that we know that genocide occurred that we can stop genocide from happening in the future. The problem with that analysis is that genocide itself is an interpretive act. It's only genocide as long as we interpret it as genocide. It's only a crime as long as we interpret it as a crime. And what we say is too often people have used those things not as warnings, but as templates. Hitler used the Armenian genocide as a template for what he wanted to do to the Jews. It inspired him. It gave him something to copy, not something to be scared of. ISIS looks back at the oppression of 7th century Muslim caliphate and doesn't say, oh, that was really bad, we shouldn't do that anymore because it was mean. They say, we should recreate that because it was glorious. And they create a narrative around those acts that justifies their ideology. So if they come up and say, these are the only things that prevent us from repeating the past, we say they might as well be things that make the situation where we actually do repeat the past, because it is the narrative that constructs history, not the things themselves. Yes, go ahead.
So under your paradigm, will people know the fact that their history is changed by states or not?
No, absolutely not. People will be completely unaware that the state has changed the history, and the state will do whatever it can to make them as unaware as possible. This might take 20 years, this might take 30 years. We don't know, but the state will do it in secret, and people will never ever know. So what have we told you today? We've told you that history binds identities. That history isn't an absolute truth. There's no truth out there in history. That we construct history to interpretive acts. And what we say is that when that history binds citizens, when it limits their choices, when it keeps them in a mental prison, that the state has a duty to liberate its citizens. That because citizens can't forget history for themselves, the state needs to step in and forget it for them. Because the individual can't create their own history, because the individual can't redefine truth on their own, we need the state to come in and redefine that truth for them in order to open up possibilities for them. And furthermore, we say that only by doing this, perhaps, can we prevent things like this from happening again. At least citizens will be able to define themselves in a more free way. And for those reasons, we are very, very happy.